Okay, this is the first video in our Earth History unit where we discuss fossil and fossil formation. The Earth History unit is where we take a look at how we figure out what's occurred on the Earth in the past according to the rock layers and fossils, determining things called relative age and absolute age. So, the first part of the unit focused on fossils and how they're formed. First of all, what fossils are is they are preserved remains of ancient organisms. In most cases, in some cases you can have fossils that are just footprints, or maybe a fossilized dinosaur nest, but as a rule that's what a fossil is. Fossils, in order to understand it, you have to know where you find them. They're generally found in sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock that's made is made from sediment, sand and clay and mud that's been compacted, and organisms die and get trapped in there and they end up being preserved. You don't find fossils generally in igneous or metamorphic rock. Igneous is what you see in lava flows from volcanoes, which of course wouldn't preserve any organisms' bodies, or magma, which is basically lava that hasn't reached the surface of the ground. So those two things, when they cool, aren't going to preserve any living material. Metamorphic rock is these two rocks, layers of these rocks possibly, that because of the heat and pressure in the Earth's crust have been partially melted and contorted, which also wouldn't preserve any kind of fossils in them. So we find fossils in sedimentary rock in general, with a few examples which we'll see in just a minute. Now, so the list of types of fossils and how they're formed, you got to know, and first of all, as I just said, most fossils are found in sedimentary rock. And of all the different fossils we've talked about in class, the first part of this list here are fossils that are somehow related to sedimentary rock. So trace fossils are fossils that actually show activities or behaviors of organisms, like footprints showed if they walked on one or two legs, or two legs or four legs. If they dug burrows, if they built nests. Dinosaurs, we know, build nests because we have fossilized dinosaur nests. So trace fossils leave a trace about the behaviors of organisms. Imprint fossils are caused when an organism that's dying and decaying in sediment, so here's a sad fish, the proteins and stuff that it has actually stains the sedimentary sand material that it's decomposing on. And what you get from that is, as the sedimentary rock forms, is essentially a stain, or what is properly called an imprint of that organism. It's not one where you can pull out the bones and dissect it. It's kind of like a stamp on the rock's surface. Petrified fossils are fossils where you actually do dig out like a dinosaur bone, or you dig out a petrified tree trunk, because what's happened to the actual bone or tree or mineral or whatever, when it gets buried, water that flows into this area through the ground carries in with it minerals from the soil, and the minerals eventually kind of accumulate there, kind of like you see that the white calcium deposits on a shower head in your shower, and eventually what was living tissue gets replaced by all the minerals and from the soil that flows into it from water flows, and that makes what was a bone turn into essentially a bunch of minerals, also known as a rock, and we call those petrified fossils. Mold and casts are another way that you can find evidence of fossils, and the example that I showed in class is this trilobite here. Sometimes when a fossil breaks or is isolated from its sedimentary material, you have this impression of what was the organism, and that part is called the mold, and then the piece that it makes, or the piece that it connects to, is called the cast. So the organism would have been this when it was fossilized, covered in sediment, but that organism was petrified. That's what this is. It's a petrified cast, and the impression it's left in the rock material is called the mold. And kind of think of it as you can go through and stamp Play-Doh with it to make more copies of this guy. That's kind of how the mold and the cast works. Other ways of fossil formation that aren't in sedimentary rock, of course, freezing has a way of preserving organisms because it prevents the body parts from decaying over time. So we find, Ötzi, the Iceman, and they've found mastodons in frozen ice where they've been able to isolate and get their preserved material. Amber was made famous by Jurassic Park. Amber is the fossilized tree sap, where you can have insects and other small organisms trapped inside of it and preserving their remains in their bodies. The tar pits are areas on the earth, like in California, the La Brea tar pits, where oil is oozed out of the ground that's so thick, if an organism walks in it, they actually can get trapped and die in there, and their bones get preserved by the tar. Last part of this first unit here was talking about, well, we're learning about fossils on the first part of the unit. Well, what do fossils actually help teach us about the Earth history, which is really the point of the unit? Well, some of it they teach us is about life. The fossils help teach us about some things about life, and some fossils teach us about the history of the Earth. So just breaking them down real quickly, fossils can teach us, and they were a big piece of the evidence we learned in the last unit, that evolution on the planet's happened. Organisms have changed over time. Fossils help us see the diversity that's existed in life on the planet, from dinosaurs to sea creatures to birds and different organisms that fly in the air. Fossils also help us see when different types of organisms first appeared on the Earth, and when some of them actually went extinct, and in some cases when they evolved into other organisms. So those are all kind of the life piece of it. Fossils also can teach us more about the Earth in general. They can teach us about past climate. For example, in class, we saw a leaf that was dug up in Castle Rock that had this long tip on it right here, which pointed to that the area of Castle Rock and most of the general Denver area probably was at one time a tropical rainforest, because these tips on leaves like this evolve to help channel water off of them in a very rainy area. We see that on leaves of plants today that live in the tropical rainforest. So it teaches in this specific case that the area that we live in Colorado used to be a tropical rainforest. Fossils also help us see changes on the Earth's surface, or changes in the Earth's surface. In one case we talked about in class that this seashell was dug up in an area near Breckenridge, Colorado, high up in the mountains, which of course high in the mountains isn't the sea. But this fossil gives us a clue that, hey, those mountains at some point had to be exposed or underneath the ocean, helping us to see that even though the mountains are huge and have been there for millions of years, in Colorado the Rocky Mountains haven't always been there. At one point it was actually related to an ocean. So fossils help us learn lots of things about the past Earth and Earth history, about life and about the Earth itself. And together they help us paint a picture of what's been going on since the 4.6 billion years or so ago when it first formed.